a black businesswoman, fresh off the success of securing a major partnership for her nonprofit, arrived at the airport ready to celebrate with a well-earned first-class flight. But as she stepped up to the counter, everything changed. A gate agent dismissed her ticket, mocked her in front of a growing crowd, and accused her of not belonging. Just 10 minutes later, though, a sleek private jet landed outside, and what happened next left everyone, including the gate agent, in utter shock. Stay with me, this is a story of resilience and justice you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you believe in the power of stories to inspire change. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible moments like this. The morning began with the kind of calm that only the early hours can offer. Selena Parker, a woman of poise and quiet determination, walked into the airport terminal with an air of understated confidence. The hum of travelers, the rhythmic clinking of coffee cups, and the faint scent of jet fuel created a familiar backdrop for her journey. She had been here countless times before, but this trip was different. It wasn't just a flight, it was a celebration of hard-fought success. Selena's nonprofit, built from long nights and relentless determination, had finally gained national attention. She had allowed herself a rare indulgence, a first-class ticket. She dressed for the occasion, her tailored navy blazer fitting her like a second skin, paired with pearl earrings that whispered of elegance rather than shouted it. Her carry-on was small, efficient, and purposeful, much like the woman herself. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, a young white couple glanced at her, their eyes lingering a moment too long. Selena felt the subtle prickle of their gaze. Not new but no less irritating. She ignored it, as she had been trained to do by years of similar encounters. At the counter stood a man named David. His name tag gleamed against his pressed uniform. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly back, and his posture was one of well-practiced authority. Selena offered him a polite smile and slid her ID and ticket across the counter. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I'm here to check in for flight 827. David's eyes flicked to the ticket, then back to her, his gaze lingering on her face for a fraction of a second too long. There it was, subtle but undeniable, a flash of disbelief. His lips pressed into a tight line. "First class?" he said, his tone feigning neutrality but laced with the faintest edge of incredulity. "Yes," Selena replied, her voice steady but firm. David's fingers tapped on the keyboard with exaggerated slowness, the sound of each keystroke like a metronome counting down her patience. He glanced at the screen, then back at her. "There seems to be a problem," he said, his voice cooling. "This ticket doesn't appear to be valid for first class." Selena's smile faltered. "That must be a mistake," she said, leaning slightly forward. "I booked this ticket weeks ago and received confirmation. Could you double-check?" David raised an eyebrow, his smirk almost imperceptible but present. He tapped a few more keys before leaning back, arms crossed. "Are you sure you're in the right line? First class is for priority passengers," he said, the condescension in his voice now undeniable. Selena felt her cheeks flush, though her expression remained composed. "I am exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, her tone sharp enough to cut through his patronizing demeanor. David leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Look, ma'am, sometimes people misunderstand how these things work. Economy check-in is just down the hall." The words hit her like a slap. The calm of the morning evaporated, replaced by a simmering anger that tightened her chest. She could feel the eyes of others in the line flickering toward her, their curiosity mingling with judgment. For a moment, she considered leaving, walking away from this moment of indignity. But something in her refused to back down. "Check it again," Selena said, her voice steady but with an edge that warned against further dismissal. "I have the confirmation email if you'd like to see it." David sighed loudly, as if her very existence was an inconvenience. He glanced at her ticket again, then at the screen, his expression hardening. Finally, he called over his shoulder, "Security." Selena froze. The word echoed in her ears, sharp and cutting, like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising. The security guard, a tall man with a rigid posture, approached, his eyes scanning Selena with the same practiced indifference as David's. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. "This passenger is being disruptive," David said, his voice dripping with false professionalism. Her ticket isn't valid for first class. And she refuses to move to the appropriate line. That's not true, Selena shot back. I purchased this ticket directly from the airline. I've done nothing wrong. The guard hesitated, glancing between David and Selena. But David, emboldened by his perceived authority, waved him off. It's a simple misunderstanding, he said. She's just confused. Selena felt the heat of humiliation rising in her. The weight of judgment from the surrounding passengers pressed down on her like a physical force. She thought of all the times she had endured moments like this, subtle, insidious acts that told her she didn't belong, no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved. But this time was different. This time, she wouldn't let it slide. You'll regret this, she said softly, her voice steady with quiet resolve. David chuckled, dismissive. We'll see about that. Selena turned on her heel, her heart pounding, and pulled out her phone. As she walked away from the counter, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. When the line connected, her voice was calm but laced with steel. I need a favor, she said. Can you send the jet? For a brief moment, the din of the terminal seemed to fade away. Selena's steps grew steadier, her back straighter. The storm was coming, and she would make sure everyone, David included, felt its full force. Selena found a seat by the expansive glass windows overlooking the tarmac. The terminal buzzed with its usual hum of movement. Travelers wheeling bags, flight announcements crackling overhead, the occasional laughter of families heading toward destinations filled with promise. But for Selena, the lively backdrop felt distant, like a muted soundtrack to her growing frustration. She sat stiffly, her hands resting on her lap, her phone in a vice grip. Outwardly, she remained composed, but inside, a storm brewed. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickened, and the words from the gate agent, David, echoed in her mind. Are you sure you're in the right line? The patronizing tone, the subtle smirk, the unspoken judgment, it was all too familiar. Selena had faced these microaggressions before. They came in different forms. The hesitant glance before someone handed her the check. The assumption that her success must have been handed to her rather than earned. But today, something about David's dismissiveness felt sharper, more blatant. It wasn't just disbelief, it was exclusion. A deliberate assertion that she did not belong. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw the name of her assistant, Maya, flashing across it. Selena. Maya's voice was concerned. What happened? Elijah just called. He said you needed the jet? Selena inhaled deeply, steadying her voice. Yes, I'll explain later. Just make sure it's here in 10 minutes. Maya hesitated but trusted Selena enough not to push further. Consider it done, she replied. As the call ended, Selena straightened her posture and scanned the terminal. Around her, other passengers moved without obstruction, their interactions with staff polite, efficient, and seamless. She noticed how people of a certain look, white, well-dressed, and unbothered, were ushered through without question. It was a stark contrast to her recent humiliation at the counter. Selena's thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of laughter. A couple seated nearby whispered to one another, their eyes darting toward her before they leaned in closer. Their voices low but audible enough to sting. Must have tried to pull something, the man muttered, his tone laced with amusement. His companion chuckled softly. Yeah, probably thought she could sneak her way into first class. Selena's fingers clenched around her phone. She fought the urge to respond, knowing it would only fan the flames of their assumptions. Yet the familiar sting of being judged not for her actions, but for her presence settled deep in her chest. The humiliation wasn't private, it was public. A performance for strangers who didn't know her but felt entitled to cast their verdict. Moments later, a faint roar of engines caught her attention. Selena turned her gaze to the tarmac just as a sleek, silver private jet appeared, its polished exterior gleaming under the sunlight. It descended gracefully, its arrival commanding attention without effort. Conversations around the terminal shifted, passengers craning their necks to catch a glimpse. Whispers filled the air. Who do you think that's for? Someone asked. Must be someone important, another replied. Selena allowed herself a small, inward smile. Let them wonder. The jet taxied to a stop near the private terminal. And moments later, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the main doors of the commercial terminal. The driver stepped out, his movements brisk and deliberate, and entered the building. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Selena. "Miss Parker?" he said, his voice low but firm. Selina stood, her every movement deliberate. She smoothed her blazer and adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag. The room seemed to hold its breath as she nodded, her voice calm but resonant. "Yes, that's me." The driver gestured toward the exit, and Selina followed him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she walked, she felt the weight of countless stares on her back, a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and she was certain resentment. At the counter, David froze. He watched as the driver escorted Selina past security and toward the private exit. His smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a dawning realization that whatever assumptions he had made about her had been wildly, embarrassingly wrong. Selina didn't spare him a glance as she walked by, but she felt his eyes boring into her, his disbelief palpable. It was a small victory, but it was enough for now. The SUV's door opened, and Selina slid inside, greeted by the quiet hum of air conditioning and the faint scent of leather. As the vehicle began to move across the tarmac, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her anger hadn't dissipated, but it had transformed into something sharper resolve. Outside, the jet's stairs lowered, and the crew stood waiting, their smiles professional and warm. Selina stepped out of the car and ascended the steps with purpose. At the top, she paused briefly, turning her gaze back toward the terminal. She could see the crowd now, gathered at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. Somewhere among them was David, still frozen behind the counter. His authority diminished in an instant. Selina didn't wave, she didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she stepped into the jet, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of luxury plush leather seats, polished wood accents, and soft, ambient lighting. Selina sank into one of the chairs, her body relaxing for the first time since the ordeal began. The engines hummed softly as the jet prepared for takeoff. Selina pulled out her phone and began typing an email. Each word was precise, deliberate, and unapologetic. She detailed the incident at the counter, naming David and describing his behavior in stark, unflinching terms. She addressed the email directly to the airline's CEO, ending with a single, pointed sentence: "I expect to see real accountability and meaningful change." She hit send and placed her phone aside, her gaze turning to the window as the jet began to ascend. The city below shrank into a patchwork of roads and rooftops, the terminal a speck in the distance. Selina's anger hadn't faded, it had merely found its purpose. Today was not just about reclaiming her dignity. It was about forcing the world to confront the quiet, insidious ways it sought to diminish people like her. And as the jet soared higher, Selina vowed to ensure that no one else would endure what she had not without a fight. The jet glided smoothly through the clouds, a sanctuary far removed from the indignities Selina had faced just moments before. The world below blurred into a distant memory as the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. Yet, inside the calm of the cabin, her mind raced. The confrontation at the airport, the stares of judgment, and the smirk of a man who had assumed her place in the world did not and could not belong beside his had left an ache she could not soothe. It was a wound reopened, familiar and raw. A flight attendant approached, her manner courteous but not overly familiar. "Miss Parker, would you care for a refreshment?" she asked, her voice soft. "Tea," Selina replied. Her voice, though calm, betrayed the simmering tension beneath. She glanced at her phone, now silent on the table before her. The email had been sent, its sharp words a testament to her refusal to let the incident be swept under the rug. But silence followed. No acknowledgement, no apology, no resolution. The minutes ticked by, and Selina's thoughts turned inward, back to the countless moments of dismissal she had endured in her life. They had come in many forms: the underestimation of her abilities, the questioning of her qualifications, the disbelief in her success. And each time, she had weathered them with a quiet dignity. But something about today felt different. Today, it wasn't just her dignity that had been challenged, it was her very existence in a space she had rightfully earned. Her tea arrived, its delicate aroma filling the cabin. She cradled the cup, letting the warmth seep into her hands as she stared out at the endless blue. The scene outside was tranquil, but her reflection in the window told another story. Her eyes, steady but tired, held a quiet fury. She couldn't let this rest. Not this time. Her phone buzzed, Breaking the stillness, she snatched it up, her heart quickening as she saw the sender, Angela Carter. Executive Liaison, Atlantic Skies Airlines. The subject line read, "Urgent follow-up." She opened the email, her eyes scanning the words. "Dear Miss Parker, we deeply regret the incident that occurred at our first-class check-in counter today. Please know that this behavior is not reflective of our company's values. The matter is being reviewed with the utmost seriousness. Our CEO, Marcus Whitfield, would like to personally address your concerns at your earliest convenience. Please let us know when you would be available for a call." Selena set the phone down, her jaw tightening. The email, polished and carefully worded, lacked something fundamental: accountability. Words like regret and review did little to soothe the sting of what she had endured. It wasn't regret she wanted, it was change. Before she could respond, the intercom crackled, the pilot's voice breaking through. "Miss Parker, we'll be landing shortly. Your car will be waiting to take you to your destination." Selena nodded to no one in particular. The descent was smooth, the city below growing larger with each passing second. As the jet touched down, the familiar ache of unresolved anger and exhaustion weighed heavy on her. But as the door opened and the cool breeze brushed her face, she straightened her spine. There was no room for weariness now. The black car waiting for her was sleek, efficient, and quiet. The driver, a man in his late 40s with a professional demeanor, opened the door for her without a word. Selena slid into the backseat, her phone clutched in her hand. As the car weaved through the city, her mind began to race again. Her destination was a boutique hotel, a place of understated elegance that she had chosen for its quiet charm. But before she could settle into the comfort of anonymity, she knew she had to respond. She had to ensure that this wasn't just another moment buried under corporate niceties and empty platitudes. Once in her room, Selena sat at the small writing desk near the window. The city outside was alive, its energy pulsing through the streets below. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys as she crafted her response. Subject: Response to Incident Review. 2. Angela Carter, Executive Liaison. Dear Ms. Carter, thank you for your prompt response to my complaint regarding the incident at your first-class check-in counter earlier today. While I appreciate your acknowledgement of the issue, I must emphasize that this is not an isolated event but a symptom of a larger cultural problem within your organization. The behavior I encountered today was not merely unprofessional, it was emblematic of the implicit biases that far too often permeate spaces meant to be inclusive and equitable. Being dismissed and humiliated in front of others because of assumptions made about my appearance is an experience I know too many others have shared. I am willing to speak with Mr. Whitfield directly, but I must insist that this conversation centers on actionable steps toward creating a culture of accountability, respect, and inclusivity. Sensitivity training alone is insufficient. I want to see structural changes, policies, oversight, and transparency that ensure no one else endures what I did today. Please confirm the time for this discussion at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Selena Parker. As she read over the email one last time, Selena felt the weight of her words settle in her chest. She had spoken not just for herself but for the countless others who had been silenced by similar moments of dismissal and prejudice. The hours stretched on, and the sun began to set. Selena leaned against the window, her reflection blending with the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, people were living their lives, unaware of the quiet battles others fought daily. Battles not with fists but with words, persistence, and an unyielding belief in their own worth. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it wasn't an email. It was a call from Marcus Whitfield himself. Selena stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. This was it, the beginning of something that could be larger than herself. She answered, her voice steady. "This is Selena Parker. Miss Parker." The voice on the other end began, calm yet cautious. "I'm Marcus Whitfield. I want to personally apologize for what happened today. And more importantly, I want to understand how we can make this right." Selena exhaled, her resolve firm. "Mr. Whitfield," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "If you're truly committed to making this right, then let's talk about the changes that need to happen, not just for me, but for everyone." The conversation was just beginning. But Selena knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about her alone. It was about the invisible lines drawn in everyday life. the unspoken rules that sought to diminish some while elevating others. And today, she had decided that those lines needed to be erased once and for all. The city outside Selena's hotel window buzzed with life as twilight descended. But inside her room, the air was taut with tension. The conversation with Marcus Whitfield had ended less than an hour ago. And though he had promised swift action, Selena couldn't shake the hollow familiarity of his words. She had heard promises like his before, polished apologies, earnest reassurances, only to watch them fade into obscurity as the world moved on. The weight of history loomed large in her mind, a quiet but insistent reminder that change, real change, was rarely granted freely. Selena paced the room, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Her laptop sat open on the desk, the screen glowing with an inbox now overflowing with messages. News of her experience had begun to ripple outward. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had reached out, some with outrage, others with caution. Her phone vibrated, pulling her from her thoughts. The name on the screen stopped her in her tracks: Grace Harper. A retired civil rights lawyer and one of Selena's earliest mentors. Selena hesitated before answering. "Grace," she said, her voice steady but weary. "I heard," Grace replied, her tone firm yet tinged with the kind of warmth that only years of shared struggles could create. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Selena said, though the tightness in her chest betrayed her. "Tired, but fine." Grace chuckled softly, a sound that carried both understanding and resolve. "You don't sound fine, and you shouldn't have to be fine. Selena, what they did to you today, it's not just an insult. It's a reminder of how much work we still have to do." Selena exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Grace had a way of cutting through the noise, grounding her in moments when the weight of the world felt unbearable. "They've already reached out," Selena said. "The CEO called. He apologized, said they're taking it seriously." "And do you believe him?" Grace asked, her voice sharp. Selena hesitated. "I don't know. It's hard to tell. He sounded sincere. But sincerity isn't enough." "Exactly," Grace said. "Sincerity without action is just another way to pacify us." "What's your plan?" Selena's grip on the phone tightened. "I told him I want tangible changes, policies, oversight, transparency. But it feels insufficient. Like I'm putting a band-aid on something that needs surgery." Grace's voice softened. "Selena, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's ever been dismissed, doubted, or demeaned because of how they look. Don't let them sideline this into another PR move. Push them." Selena nodded, even though Grace couldn't see her. "I will." After the call ended, Selena felt a renewed sense of clarity. She wasn't alone in this fight, she never had been. The echoes of Grace's words lingered in her mind as she returned to her laptop and began drafting a follow-up email. One that would leave no room for ambiguity. As the night deepened, Selena's inbox continued to fill. One message, in particular, caught her eye: a forwarded link from her colleague Simone with the subject line, "You've made the news." Selena clicked the link, her heart sinking as she saw the headline, "Racial bias alleged in airline incident as private jet steals the show." The article recounted the events at the airport with startling accuracy, though Selena's name was notably absent. Comments poured in below the story, a chaotic mix of outrage, support, and skepticism. "She's just playing the race card," one commenter wrote, the words slicing through Selena like a blade. Others chimed in, their ignorance and vitriol creating a cacophony of dismissal. But there were voices of solidarity, too. "This happens all the time," one user wrote. "It's about time someone with power called it out." Selena closed the browser, her chest heavy with the weight of public scrutiny. This wasn't just about her anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own. And with that came both opportunity and danger. She had to tread carefully. The following morning, Selena woke to a flood of new emails. Among them was a response from Marcus Whitfield's office, confirming a meeting later that afternoon to discuss her concerns. She prepared meticulously, outlining her demands with precision. This wasn't going to be a polite exchange, it was going to be a reckoning. By the time the meeting began, Selena's resolve was unshakable. Marcus Whitfield appeared on the screen, his expression carefully composed. He opened with yet another apology. But Selena didn't let him linger on contrition. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice measured but firm, "what happened to me is not unique. It's a reflection of systemic issues within your organization. Apologies are a start, but they're meaningless without action. I understand, Marcus replied. We're already taking steps. Sensitivity training. A review of policies. Training alone isn't enough. Selena interrupted. Bias doesn't disappear because of a seminar. It requires accountability, oversight, and a willingness to confront the structures that enable it. I want to see a customer advisory board, one that includes diverse voices. I want transparency in how complaints are handled. And I want regular audits to measure progress. Marcus nodded, his demeanor shifting from defensive to contemplative. You're right, he said finally. We need to do better. And I want your help to make that happen. Selena hesitated. The offer was tempting, but she knew the risks. Being part of the process meant shouldering the burden of change, of fighting against inertia and resistance. But it also meant having a voice. One that couldn't be ignored. I'll consider it, she said. But first, I need to see proof that you're committed to real change. As the meeting ended, Selena felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time, she felt as though she had turned the tide. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or pushed aside. Outside, the city thrummed with life. Oblivious to the battles being waged within its walls, Selena stood at the window, her reflection blending with the skyline. The fire inside her burned brightly, fueled not by anger but by determination. Change was coming, and this time, she would make sure it didn't stop with her. Selena woke to a new kind of silence, one that was both heavy and expectant. The events of the past days felt like a tide that had risen steadily, each wave carrying more weight than the last. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. The city outside was beginning to stir, but within her, the storm raged on. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, its screen alight with notifications. She picked it up, scrolling through the messages. The news coverage had intensified. Every outlet seemed to have picked up the story now, and the headline narratives had evolved. What began as a single incident at an airport had snowballed into a larger conversation about systemic racism, privilege, and the silent power of microaggressions. Selena's name was no longer absent. Her identity had surfaced, and with it came both support and backlash. Friends and allies reached out with messages of solidarity, but the darker corners of the internet buzzed with vitriol. She's making a big deal out of nothing. Another entitled victim playing the race card. She had a private jet. What's she even complaining about? Selena's chest tightened. The words weren't new, they were part of a script she had heard her whole life. But knowing they were aimed at her, amplified by a public stage, made them sting in a way she hadn't anticipated. The day unfolded quickly. The meeting with Marcus Whitfield was set for noon, and Selena spent the morning preparing. She rehearsed her points, crafting them into a sharp, unyielding narrative. She wasn't walking into this conversation as a victim seeking restitution, she was stepping into it as an advocate demanding change. When the video call began, Marcus's face appeared on the screen, his expression a careful mask of concern and professionalism. Beside him sat Angela Carter, her demeanor cool but attentive. Selena could sense the tension in the room, the unspoken realization that this meeting wasn't just damage control, it was a reckoning. Miss Parker, Marcus began, his voice measured. Thank you for meeting with us again. Before we start, I want to reiterate how deeply sorry we are for what you experienced. It's unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring it doesn't happen again. Selena leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. I appreciate the apology, Mr. Whitfield, but apologies without action are meaningless. What I want to know is what steps you're taking to address the systemic issues within your organization that allowed this to happen. Marcus nodded, his composure faltering slightly. We've already begun implementing sensitivity training for our staff, and we're reviewing our policies. With respect, Selena interrupted, her tone sharpening. Sensitivity training is a band-aid. It doesn't address the deeper problem. The issue isn't just about individual behavior, it's about the culture you've allowed to thrive. A culture that tells people like David that they can make assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, without consequence. Angela shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Marcus met Selena's gaze. What would you propose? He asked. Selena didn't hesitate. A customer advisory board, made up of diverse voices, to ensure these issues are brought to light. A transparent system for handling complaints. So incidents like mine aren't dismissed or buried. Regular audits to measure progress and accountability. And I want to see leadership involvement not just in meetings like this, but in the implementation and enforcement of these changes. For a moment, the room was silent. Marcus glanced at Angela, who gave a slight nod. Those are ambitious proposals, he said finally. But I agree they're necessary. We're willing to work with you to make them happen. Selena exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening slightly. This isn't just about me, she said. It's about every person who's faced the same treatment and didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. If you're serious about change, it has to start here. The call ended with a tentative agreement. Selena would join the advisory board as a consultant, working alongside the airline to implement the changes she had outlined. It was a victory, but a cautious one. Selena knew the fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Selena received another notification. This time, it was a message from Simone. You've seen this, right? The text was followed by a link to a social media thread. Selena clicked the link, her stomach tightening as she read. The thread was filled with comments from current and former employees of the airline, many of them sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination. The posts painted a damning picture: favoritism in promotions, unequal treatment of staff, and a culture that dismissed complaints of racism as oversensitivity. Selena's hands trembled as she typed a response to Simone. We need to talk. This is bigger than I thought. By nightfall, Selena found herself staring out of the hotel window, the city lights shimmering against the dark sky. Her phone buzzed again, a call this time. She answered without hesitation. Selena. Grace's voice was steady. I've been following the updates. You're making waves. Selena let out a dry laugh. I'm not sure if they're the kind of waves I want. They're the kind we need, Grace said firmly. But remember, waves crash against resistance. There will be pushback more than you've already seen. I know, Selena replied, her voice quiet but resolute. But I can't let it stop me. Grace was silent for a moment before speaking again. You're doing something powerful, Selena. But don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. The fight isn't won in a day, it's a marathon. Selena nodded, the weight of Grace's words settling over her. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. As the call ended, Selena leaned back in her chair, her mind swirling with thoughts. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just her battle, it was a collective one, fueled by the voices of those who had come before her and those who would come after. She closed her eyes, the city's hum lulling her into a rare moment of peace. Tomorrow, the fight would continue, but tonight, she allowed herself to breathe, to rest, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. The morning was deceptively calm. Sunlight streamed through the window of Selena's hotel room, painting golden patterns across the bedspread. She sat at the small table by the window, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the last few days had thrust her into a whirlwind she hadn't anticipated. And today promised to be no different. Her phone buzzed again, a relentless stream of notifications that she had come to expect but could no longer ignore. The social media thread exposing the airline's internal biases had gone viral overnight. Employees, passengers, and even industry watchdogs had weighed in, their voices creating a tapestry of outrage, solidarity, and disbelief. The story was no longer just hers, it had become a rallying cry for systemic change. Yet, with visibility came backlash. Her inbox was now a battlefield. Among the supportive messages were venomous attacks, accusing her of overreacting, of seeking attention, of weaponizing her privilege. The familiar script played out again, louder now, amplified by the digital age. Selena's chest tightened as she read one particularly hateful email. People like you are the reason this country is falling apart. Always looking for something to complain about. The words stung, not because they were original, but because they were relentless. A constant reminder of the forces arrayed against her. But there was no time to dwell. Today was the first formal meeting with the advisory board she had pushed for. And she had no intention of entering it unprepared. The meeting was set in a sleek corporate conference room high above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline. Selena arrived early, her presence commanding yet understated. She wore a tailored black suit, her expression calm but resolute. As the other members of the board filed and executives, consultants, and activists. She studied them carefully. Most were cordial, though a few avoided her gaze, their body language betraying discomfort. Marcus Whitfield entered last, his polished demeanor intact but tinged with tension. He offered a brief nod to Selina as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his tone measured. "This board represents a crucial step toward addressing the issues that have come to light over the past week. I trust that today's discussion will set the foundation for meaningful change." Selina spoke up immediately, her voice cutting through the corporate pleasantries. "Before we discuss foundations, we need to address accountability. This isn't just about implementing new policies, it's about acknowledging how we got here in the first place." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the executives, a man with silver hair and an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Parker, while we recognize the need for accountability, I hope you'll understand that change takes time." Selina's gaze locked on him. Unflinching. "Time isn't the issue. Willingness is. The problems we're discussing didn't appear overnight, they've been allowed to fester because it was easier to ignore them than to confront them." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Selina, we're committed to addressing these issues. That's why this board exists. But commitment without transparency is meaningless." Selina countered. "What happens when the cameras are no longer pointed at you? When the public outrage dies down? How do we ensure this isn't just another cycle of empty promises?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Angela Carter, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. "What do you propose, Selina?" Selina took a breath, steadying herself. "First, a third-party audit of all internal complaints over the past 5 years. Every case of discrimination, every instance of bias. We need to know the scope of the problem. Second, a public commitment to diversifying leadership at all levels, not just token hires, but genuine representation. Third, a transparent process for addressing future complaints, with real consequences for those who perpetuate harm." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group like a heavy fog. Marcus hesitated before speaking. "Those are significant demands. They're necessary," Selina replied. "If you're serious about change, this is where it starts." The meeting ended with a tentative agreement to implement Selina's proposals. But she knew better than to trust words alone. As she left the building, her phone buzzed with yet another notification. This time, it was a news alert. Airline CEO faces mounting pressure amid allegations of racial bias. Selina's steps quickened as she scanned the article. The piece included excerpts from the viral thread, as well as anonymous testimonies from employees. It painted a damning picture, one that the airline could no longer dismiss. Her phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Grace. "Selina," Grace began, her voice laced with urgency. "Have you seen the latest news?" "I have," Selina replied. "It's spreading faster than I expected. And the pushback will come just as fast." Grace warned. "You're not just challenging a corporation, you're challenging a system. Be prepared for them to fight back." Selina tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm ready." That evening, Selina returned to her hotel room. Exhausted but resolute, she sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. Her reflection stared back at her, a reminder of the journey she had embarked on and the battles yet to come. Her laptop chimed with a new email. It was from Marcus Whitfield. "Selina, thank you for your insights during today's meeting. I want to personally assure you that we are committed to implementing your proposals. I would like to meet privately to discuss next steps. Please let me know your availability. Best, Marcus." Selina closed the laptop, her mind racing. The email was a small victory, but it was far from the end. She had forced a conversation that many had tried to avoid. But now the real work would begin, the work of turning promises into action, of holding power accountable, of dismantling the structures that allowed people like David to thrive unchecked. As she prepared for bed, Selina allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with resistance and challenges she couldn't yet foresee. But she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The storm she had started was growing. And this time, she wouldn't let it pass without leaving the world forever changed. The storm that Selina had felt brewing for days was now in full force. What began as a personal slight had grown into a public reckoning. And it was no longer contained within the walls of corporate boardrooms or viral social media threads. The nation was watching, the stakes rising with every headline and soundbite. And with each new development, Selena felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her, sharpening her resolve but exhausting her in equal measure. Selena's day began with a phone call she hadn't expected, though perhaps she should have. It was from a journalist at a major network, their tone friendly but pointed. "Miss Parker," the voice began, "I've been following your story closely. Would you be willing to sit down for an exclusive interview? People are hungry to hear your perspective firsthand." Selena paused, her thoughts racing. She knew what this meant: visibility. A chance to shape the narrative on her own terms. But it also meant stepping deeper into the spotlight, exposing herself to a level of scrutiny that could be as brutal as it was empowering. "I'll think about it," she replied carefully, ending the call with a polite but firm promise to follow up. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand. The path forward was clear, but it was also treacherous. She thought of Grace's words from the night before. "You're not just challenging a corporation, you're challenging a system." The thought both emboldened and terrified her. Later that morning, Selena arrived at her nonprofit's downtown office. The space was modest but filled with energy, her team working tirelessly to manage the influx of attention. As she entered, her assistant Maya hurried to her side. "Selena," Maya said, her voice low but urgent. "There's something you need to see." She handed Selena a tablet, the screen displaying a new article. The headline read, "Corporate Retaliation? Whistleblowers Face Backlash Following Airline Scandal." Selena's stomach dropped as she scanned the piece. Former employees who had spoken out about the airline's toxic culture were now reporting threats to their livelihoods. One whistleblower claimed they had been contacted by a private investigator, their employment history scrutinized. Another said they had received vague but menacing emails warning them to stay in their lane. "They're trying to silence people," Maya said, her voice tight with anger. "This isn't just about you anymore, Selena. They're going after anyone who stands with you." Selena clenched her fists, the anger simmering in her chest now boiling over. She knew this tactic well. It was the weapon of those in power, used to intimidate and isolate. It was an attempt to make her fight seem not only unwinnable but dangerous. "We're not backing down," Selena said firmly. "If they think fear will stop us, they're wrong." That afternoon, Selena met with Marcus Whitfield in person for the first time. The meeting was held in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters, the air thick with tension. Marcus greeted her with the same polished charm he had displayed over video calls. But Selena could sense the cracks beneath the surface. "Miss Parker," Marcus began, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming. I want to assure you that we're committed to moving forward with the changes we discussed." Selena took her seat, her gaze steady. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitfield, but I'm here to talk about something else." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Oh? I've been made aware of the retaliation against employees who have spoken out," Selena said, her voice like steel. "I need to know what your company is doing to address this." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I wasn't aware of any retaliation." "Then you're not paying attention," Selena interrupted, "because it's happening. And if you don't take action to protect these people, it will reflect not only on your company but on you personally." For a moment, Marcus looked as though he might push back. But something in Selena's unwavering gaze stopped him. He nodded slowly. "I'll look into it," he said. "You have my word." Selena didn't flinch. "Good, because if you don't, I will." By evening, Selena was back at her hotel, the day's events playing over in her mind. The meeting with Marcus had been a small victory, but the retaliation against whistleblowers weighed heavily on her. The fight was growing larger, more complex, and more dangerous. She felt the exhaustion creeping in, but she refused to let it take hold. Her phone buzzed, a call coming through from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Miss Parker?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, cautious. "This is Lisa, a former employee at Atlantic Skies. I need your help." Selena's heart quickened. "What's going on, Lisa?" The woman's voice trembled. "After I spoke out, someone came to my house. They didn't say who they were, but they asked a lot of questions about my time at the company. They knew things about me, personal things. I'm scared." Selena's grip on the phone tightened. "You're not alone," she said firmly. "I'll make sure you're protected." "Thank you," Lisa whispered, her relief palpable. I didn't know who else to call. As the call ended, Selena sat in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This was no longer just a battle for accountability, it was a fight for safety. For justice. For the very right to speak without fear. The night stretched on as Selena worked tirelessly, coordinating with her team to ensure that Lisa and others like her had legal support and protection. She reached out to Grace, whose legal expertise would be invaluable in the coming days. "This is getting dangerous," Grace said, her tone both concerned and resolute. "But you're doing the right thing. Selena, don't let them scare you." "I won't," Selena replied, her voice steady, "but we need to move fast. They're not going to stop." As the first rays of dawn broke through the window, Selena finally allowed herself a moment to rest. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But she also knew this: she wasn't fighting alone. And no matter how high the stakes rose, she would see this through. The world was watching, and Selena Parker was ready to meet the moment. The morning arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Selena stood by the hotel window, staring out at the city she had come to know so well. Its streets bustling with a rhythm that felt detached from her current reality. The gravity of the last few days bore down on her, but she stood tall, fortified by the voices she was now representing. This was no longer just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or marginalized. Her phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was Grace. "Selena," Grace said, her voice sharp and clear. "I've been going over the whistleblower cases. There's a pattern here. The company isn't just retaliating, they're using intimidation as a strategy. They're trying to wear people down, hoping they'll stay quiet." Selena closed her eyes, her hand tightening around the phone. "We can't let them succeed." "We won't," Grace replied, "but you need to be careful. They're escalating, and the closer you get to real change, the harder they'll push back." By midday, Selena was back at the nonprofit's office, surrounded by her team. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of urgency and determination. Maya handed her a folder filled with statements from current and former employees of Atlantic Skies Airlines. Each one told a story of mistreatment, bias, and a culture that thrived on exclusion. "They're coming forward because of you," Maya said, her voice filled with both pride and concern. "But they're scared, Selena. They're scared of what might happen to them." Selena nodded, her jaw tightening. "That's why we have to keep fighting. We can't let fear win." The next few hours were a blur of calls, meetings, and coordination. Selena worked tirelessly to connect whistleblowers with legal resources, strategize with her team, and prepare for a press conference scheduled for the following day. The conference would be her most public moment yet. A chance to bring the fight to a larger audience, but also a risk that would place her squarely in the crosshairs of those who wanted her silenced. As evening fell, Selena received an email from Marcus Whitfield's office. The subject line read, "Urgent request for meeting." She opened it, her pulse quickening. The message was brief but direct. "Miss Parker, we need to discuss the whistleblower allegations immediately. Please come to our headquarters tonight." Marcus Whitfield. Selena hesitated. The timing was suspicious, and the lack of detail only heightened her unease. She forwarded the email to Grace, adding a single line, "What do you think?" The response came quickly. "This could be a trap. Don't go alone." Selena decided to proceed, but on her terms. She asked Maya to accompany her and notified a trusted journalist of the meeting, ensuring there would be a record of her whereabouts. If Marcus Whitfield thought he could intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. The corporate headquarters was eerily quiet when Selena arrived. The receptionist led her and Maya to a conference room where Marcus was already waiting. He stood as they entered, his expression strained. "Miss Parker," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." Selena remained standing. "You said this was urgent. What's going on?" Marcus glanced at Maya, then back at Selena. "This is a sensitive matter. Are you sure you want someone else here?" "She stays," Selena said firmly. "Now, speak." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "The whistleblower allegations are damaging the company's reputation. Investors are getting nervous, and the board is demanding action. I need your help to contain this." Selena's eyes narrowed. "Contain this? You think this is about damage control?" "This is about accountability." "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "But if this gets out of hand, it could destroy the company, and the changes you've been fighting for will never happen." Selena leaned forward, her voice steady but cutting. "The only thing that will destroy this company is your refusal to confront the truth. People are risking everything to speak out. And you want me to help you silence them? That's not going to happen." Marcus's composure cracked. "I'm trying to save this company," he said, his voice rising. "Do you understand what's at stake?" "I understand perfectly," Selena replied. "What's at stake is whether you're willing to stand on the right side of history. This isn't just about your company, it's about justice. If you can't see that, then you're part of the problem." The tension in the room was suffocating. Marcus looked as though he might argue. But Selena didn't give him the chance. She stood, her movements deliberate. "This meeting is over," she said. "If you want my help, start by protecting the people who are speaking out. Until then, don't contact me again." As Selena and Maya left the building, the weight of the confrontation settled over her. The stakes were higher than ever, and the opposition was growing more desperate. But Selena knew she couldn't back down, not now. Not when so much was on the line. That night, as she prepared for the press conference, Selena felt a quiet resolve take hold. The fight was reaching its crescendo, and she was ready to meet it head on. The world was watching, and she would not let them turn away. The storm was no longer something she feared. It was something she had become. The day of the press conference dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with anticipation. Selena stood in front of the hotel mirror, her reflection calm but resolute. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a dark navy suit, understated yet powerful, a subtle reminder that she was not to be underestimated. Today wasn't just about speaking the truth, it was about making the world listen. The press conference had been organized in the heart of the city, in a modest hall that now buzzed with activity. Journalists from local and national outlets jostled for position, cameras clicking as they set up for the event. Outside, a growing crowd had gathered, some holding signs of support, others there out of curiosity. The air was charged, the tension palpable. Selena arrived with her team, flanked by Maya and Grace. As she stepped out of the car, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones were raised, flashes illuminating her path as she made her way inside. Her presence commanded attention, and every step she took seemed to echo with the weight of what was to come. The hall fell silent as Selena approached the podium. She took a moment to steady herself, her hands gripping the edges of the lectern. The room felt smaller now, the faces of the audience a sea of expectation. She cleared her throat, her voice steady as she began. "Good morning," she said, her tone measured but firm. "I stand before you today not just as an individual, but as a representative of countless voices that have been ignored for far too long." She paused, letting her words settle. "Over the past week, I've been thrust into a fight I didn't choose, but one I can no longer turn away from. What began as a single moment of disrespect has revealed a culture that thrives on exclusion, silence, and fear. And let me be clear, this is not just about one company or one incident. This is about the systemic injustices that permeate our everyday lives. The unspoken rules that tell some of us we don't belong." Her voice grew stronger, each word striking like a hammer. "I've heard the stories from employees who faced retaliation for speaking out. From passengers who were treated as though they were less than human. Their experiences are not isolated. They are part of a pattern, one that cannot be ignored any longer." The audience was rapt, the room charged with an energy that was both electric and solemn. Selena's gaze swept across the room, her resolve unshaken. "I am here to say that enough is enough. We cannot allow fear to silence us. We cannot allow those in power to bury the truth under the weight of intimidation. Change is not a request, it is a demand." As Selena finished her speech, the room erupted into applause. But the moment was short-lived. A journalist in the front row raised their hand, their voice cutting through the din. "Miss Parker, how do you respond to those who say you're overreacting? That you're using your position to stir unnecessary controversy?" Selena met the question head-on, her expression unflinching. "To those people, I would ask, what's unnecessary about demanding dignity? What's controversial about wanting fairness? This isn't about me, it's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. What so many others have. If that makes some people uncomfortable, then perhaps they should ask themselves why." Another journalist chimed in, their tone skeptical. "Do you really believe one press conference will lead to meaningful change? Or is this just about making noise?" Selena's voice didn't waver. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens through persistence, through action, through refusing to let the conversation die. This isn't about noise, it's about accountability. And I will not stop until that accountability is realized. As the press conference concluded, Selena stepped away from the podium, her heart pounding. The questions had been pointed, the skepticism palpable, but she had stood her ground. Outside the hall, the crowd had swelled, their chants audible even from inside. She could hear them calling her name, their voices a reminder that this fight was bigger than any one person. Maya approached, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You were incredible," she said, "but you need to see this." She handed Selena her phone. The screen displaying a new headline: Whistleblower threats intensify as airline faces mounting scrutiny. The article detailed new reports of retaliation, employees describing anonymous threats and invasive investigations. The tactics were escalating, the stakes rising. Selena's jaw tightened as she read. The fight was no longer just about exposing the truth, it was about protecting those who dared to speak it. She turned to Grace, who had been watching from the sidelines. "We need to act," Selena said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about accountability anymore. It's about safety." Grace nodded. "I'll start drafting a legal response. We'll need to involve outside counsel. Maybe even federal authorities. They're not just testing us, they're trying to break us." "They won't," Selena replied, the fire in her eyes burning brighter than ever. "Not while I'm here." That evening, Selena returned to her hotel room, her body weary but her mind racing. The press conference had been a victory, but it was only one battle in a much larger war. She sat by the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Her phone buzzed with a new message. This one from Marcus Whitfield. It was short, almost terse. "We need to talk. Call me." Selena stared at the screen, her emotions a swirl of anger, determination, and something she couldn't quite name. She knew the conversation would be critical, but she also knew this: she wouldn't bend. Not now. Not ever. As the night deepened, Selena allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The storm was raging, but she was no longer afraid. She was the eye of the storm, unyielding, unbreakable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, but for now, Selena rested, her resolve as unshakable as the rising tide. The world was changing, and she would make sure it changed for the better. Selena sat in the conference room, the air thick with tension. Across the table, Marcus Whitfield looked more rattled than she had ever seen him. The polished veneer that had carried him through their previous interactions had cracked, revealing a man scrambling to regain control. The stakes had risen too high, and the walls were closing in. "I'm not sure you understand the gravity of this situation," Marcus began, his voice tight. "The company is under siege. Investors are panicking. The board is threatening to act if this isn't resolved immediately." Selena folded her hands calmly on the table, her gaze unwavering. "What exactly do you mean by resolved, Marcus? Because if you're asking me to step back or silence those who've spoken out, you're wasting your breath." Marcus leaned forward, his frustration palpable. "I'm asking for reason. These whistleblower allegations are painting us as villains, and it's destabilizing everything. We need to control the narrative before it destroys us." Selena didn't flinch. "The narrative isn't the problem. The truth is, and you're only proving the point by focusing on damage control instead of addressing the harm your company has caused." For a moment, Marcus looked as though he might argue, but instead, he exhaled heavily, slumping slightly in his chair. "Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under? How much is at stake?" Selena's voice was firm but measured. "I do. But the stakes have always been high for people like me, people who've had to fight every day just to be seen as equal. If you want my help, Marcus, stop treating this as a PR crisis and start treating it as an opportunity to change." The meeting ended with no clear resolution, and Selena left the building feeling both frustrated and resolute. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no going back now. She checked her phone as she walked, her inbox flooded with messages, some supportive, others laced with anger and venom. Among them was a notification from a whistleblower support group she had helped organize. Another former employee had come forward, this one with damning evidence, internal emails detailing deliberate efforts to suppress complaints of discrimination. The revelation was explosive, a crack in the corporate armor that could not be ignored. That evening, Selena sat with Grace and Maya in her hotel room. The evidence spread out before them. The emails were shocking but not surprising. each line a stark reminder of the systemic rot she was fighting to expose. "This is it," Grace said, her voice steady but intense. "This is the leverage we need. They can't talk their way out of this." Selena nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "We need to release this carefully. If we handle it wrong, they'll spin it as a smear campaign. We need the public to see this for what it is, the truth." Maya chimed in, her tone resolute. "We'll draft a statement and work with the whistleblower to ensure they're protected." "But Selena, this is going to escalate things. Are you ready for that?" Selena looked at both women, her determination clear. "I've been ready since the moment they tried to silence me. Let's do this." The following morning, the evidence was made public through a coordinated release to trusted journalists and advocacy organizations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines screamed of corruption and cover-ups. Social media erupted with outrage. And public figures began weighing in. Selena watched it all unfold from her office, her phone buzzing constantly with updates. Each new reaction felt like a step forward. But she knew the backlash was coming. And it didn't take long. By mid-afternoon, a statement from Atlantic Skies Airlines had been released, dismissing the emails as misinterpreted and accusing Selena of orchestrating a campaign to damage the company. The tone was defensive, the message clear. They were going to fight dirty. Selena's team gathered around her, their expressions a mix of anger and resolve. "They're trying to discredit you," Maya said. "We need to respond." Selena shook her head. "No, let them flail. The truth is on our side. And every move they make only proves how desperate they are." As the day wore on, the tension reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside Atlantic Skies headquarters, demanding accountability. Inside, the board convened an emergency meeting, their internal divisions spilling into the public eye. Whistleblowers continued to come forward, their stories painting an ever clearer picture of systemic abuse. By nightfall, Selena received a call from Marcus. His voice was strained, his words clipped. "Selena, I need to see you. Tonight." She hesitated but agreed, sensing that the pressure had finally cracked him. When she arrived at his office, he looked exhausted, his suit rumpled, his expression grim. "I can't stop this," he said, his voice low. "The board wants to cut their losses. They're looking for scapegoats." Selena raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's going to solve anything?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but they're panicking. They don't care about fixing the problem, they just want to survive." Selena leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Then show them what real leadership looks like. Take responsibility. Commit to the changes we've discussed. Prove that you're willing to do the hard work." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging. "You're right. It's time." The next morning, Marcus held a press conference, flanked by Selena and other members of the advisory board. His voice was steady but emotional as he admitted to the company's failings and pledged sweeping reforms. It was a start, a fragile but significant step toward accountability. As the cameras flashed and the crowd murmured, Selena stood beside him, her presence a reminder that this fight was far from over. The storm had reached its peak, but the aftermath would be just as critical. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of hope. Change was coming, and she would make sure it didn't stop until the job was done. The days following Marcus Whitfield's press conference felt like a blur, a cacophony of media reactions, boardroom maneuvers, and whispered conversations that carried the weight of transformation or resistance. For Selena, the fight had entered its most precarious stage. The world was watching, but the machinery of power was still grinding, still finding ways to protect itself. Selena sat in the modest office of her nonprofit, surrounded by folders, emails, and a team that had grown both weary and galvanized. Maya entered, carrying a printed article, her expression a mixture of triumph and concern. "They've started the internal audit," she said, placing the document on Selena's desk. "But it's already being spun as a corporate reset. They're trying to claim victory before they've even begun." Selena picked up the article, scanning the carefully curated language of the press release. Words like transparency, commitment, and inclusion jumped out at her, hollow in their vagueness. The phrases felt designed to pacify, not to enact real change. "They're throwing a coat of paint on a crumbling structure," Selena said, her voice sharp. "This isn't progress, it's theater." Grace, seated across the room, nodded in agreement. "They think they've bought themselves time. But time is exactly what we can't afford to give them. Selena leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. We need to keep the pressure on. If they want to use words like transparency, we'll force them to show their work. That afternoon, Selena drafted a public letter addressed to Marcus Whitfield and the Atlantic Skies Board. It was direct, uncompromising, and detailed, outlining specific steps the company needed to take to turn promises into action. She demanded the release of a timeline for reforms, a breakdown of how resources would be allocated to ensure equity, and a public acknowledgement of the whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose the truth. The letter was published across major platforms, its tone unrelenting. Within hours, it had been picked up by news outlets, sparking renewed debate. Public support poured in, but so did resistance. Online forums buzzed with arguments, some accusing Selena of being too aggressive, others of not pushing hard enough. The divide was stark, reflecting the deeper fractures in a society still grappling with its own complicity. That evening, as Selena prepared for a live interview on a national news network, she felt the weight of what was at stake. The host was known for their pointed questions, their ability to needle at vulnerabilities. Selena braced herself, knowing this would be as much about defending her position as it was about advancing her cause. The studio lights were blinding, the cameras positioned like watchful sentinels. The host greeted her with a professional smile, their tone polite but probing. "Miss Parker," they began, "you've become the face of this movement almost overnight. But some critics argue that your demands are unrealistic, even disruptive to a company trying to move forward. How do you respond to that?" Selena's expression didn't falter. "Change is always disruptive," she said, "but it's only unrealistic to those who benefit from the status quo. The demands I've made aren't about tearing down a company, they're about building a culture where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. If that's disruptive, then perhaps it's a disruption we need." The host nodded, pressing on. "But do you believe that systemic issues like racism can be addressed within corporate structures? Or is this just the first step in a larger fight?" Selena took a breath, her voice steady. "This is a step, a crucial one, but systemic racism isn't confined to corporations, it's woven into every facet of our society. Addressing it requires more than policy changes, it requires a fundamental shift in how we see and value each other. This fight is part of a larger movement, and it won't end here." The interview aired to widespread acclaim, but the backlash was equally intense. Selena's inbox filled with both messages of gratitude and seething vitriol. One email, in particular, stood out, a message from an anonymous sender warning her to choose her battles wisely. Selena stared at the words, their implicit threat lingering in the air. She forwarded the email to Grace, who responded almost immediately, "They're scared. That's a good sign, but stay vigilant." As the week unfolded, the tension reached a breaking point. Atlantic Skies announced a series of immediate reforms, including the resignation of key executives implicated in the whistleblower allegations. But the news was overshadowed by a coordinated counter-narrative, a campaign to paint Selena as a divisive figure, an opportunist using the movement for personal gain. Selena's name became a lightning rod, a symbol of both hope and controversy. Protesters rallied outside Atlantic Skies headquarters, their signs a mix of support and opposition. The noise was deafening, the lines of division clearer than ever. Late one night, as Selena sat alone in her office, her phone buzzed with a call. It was Marcus. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice heavy. "I fought you because I was afraid of what this would cost. Afraid of what I might lose. But I see now that you were right. This isn't about survival, it's about doing what's right." Selena closed her eyes, her exhaustion momentarily giving way to relief. "It's not too late, Marcus, but you have to mean it." "I do," he said, "and I need your help to make sure this doesn't stop here." As the call ended, Selena leaned back in her chair, the weight of the fight still heavy but tempered by a glimmer of progress. She knew the road ahead would be long, the obstacles unrelenting, but for the first time, she felt the faintest shift, the beginnings of a new foundation, built not on fear but on the promise of something better. The storm hadn't passed, but the winds were changing, and Selena Parker, unyielding and resolute, was ready to see it through to the end. The morning air was heavy with anticipation. Selena stood in the same airport terminal where her journey had begun weeks ago. It felt surreal, as if she had come full circle. The bustling crowds moved around her, oblivious to the battles she had waged. But for Selena, the terminal held the weight of everything that had transpired, a battlefield disguised as a mundane space. She approached the first-class counter, her steps deliberate. The staff greeted her with warm smiles, their demeanor professional but tinged with a nervous awareness of who she was. This time, there were no questioning looks, no patronizing tones. She handed over her ticket, her voice calm. "I'm here to check in," she said, the faintest edge of triumph in her tone. "Of course, Miss Parker," the agent replied, his hands slightly trembling as he processed her details. "Have a wonderful flight." Selena nodded and turned toward the security checkpoint. Behind her, she could feel the gazes of onlookers, some curious, others knowing, but this time, their stares didn't sting. She had reclaimed her space, her dignity, and her power. The weeks following Marcus Whitfield's call had been a whirlwind. Atlantic Skies Airlines had committed to sweeping reforms, but the fight to ensure their implementation was ongoing. Selena had become a fixture in public discourse, her name synonymous with both hope and controversy. The weight of being a symbol wasn't lost on her, but she carried it with a quiet resolve. The advisory board she had fought for was now in full operation. Meetings were intense and often contentious, as executives resisted the systemic changes she demanded. But Selena refused to back down, using every tool at her disposal to push for transparency and accountability. One of her most significant victories came when the airline publicly acknowledged the whistleblowers who had come forward, promising them protection and reparations. For Selena, it was a bittersweet moment, justice for those who had risked everything, but a reminder of how much had been lost in the process. That afternoon, Selena attended a community event organized by her nonprofit. The room was packed with activists, volunteers, and supporters, all eager to hear her speak. As she stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I started this journey, I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't know that one moment of indignity at an airport counter would uncover so much more, so much pain, so much injustice, but also so much hope." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This fight has never been just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the world we want to build, the values we want to uphold, and the courage it takes to demand more." The room erupted into applause, the energy electric, but Selena wasn't finished. "We've made progress," she continued, "but we can't stop here. Change is a process, not a moment. It requires all of us to stay vigilant, to hold those in power accountable, and to never accept less than what we deserve." The applause was thunderous, the crowd rising to its feet. Selena stood tall, letting the moment wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, not because the fight was over, but because she knew it would continue. That evening, Selena returned to her hotel, the city lights twinkling outside her window. She sat at the small desk, her laptop open as she reviewed emails and prepared for the next day's meetings. Her phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "You've done incredible work, Selena. Don't forget to take care of yourself." Selena smiled faintly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she replied, "Thank you. I'm learning to balance it all." The following morning, Selena boarded her flight. As the plane ascended, she looked out the window, the city below shrinking into a patchwork of roads and rooftops. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, a reminder of the possibilities yet to come. She thought of the countless people who had reached out to her, sharing their stories of resilience and pain. She thought of the whistleblowers who had risked everything to demand justice. And she thought of the moments that had brought her here, moments of humiliation, defiance, and quiet triumph. Selena knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But she also knew that she wasn't walking it alone. The tide was turning, and she was determined to see it through. As the plane soared higher, Selena closed her eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. The storm she had faced had transformed her, forging her into a force of nature. And now, with the world watching, she was ready to keep pushing forward. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning.